let's say we don't enter a weight and a dim on 200 items. That's meaningful in the grand scheme of things if you rent those 200 items, because it's going to, there are forms and printouts and all sorts of things that are tallying these things all the time and calculating things and various formulas, and that affects that data. So if you don't have that stuff and it's not consistent and it's not all filled out all the time, you're kind of sort of selling your system short, and your system is not going to function the way it should. You're not going to be able to have, I mean, we're still working on it, and part of it was the big thing with going with Beam was the accuracy of that data and being able to say, I am confident in these reports, I'm confident in these printouts within R2 that this data is accurate and it's being tabulated or calculated based on a real data. And that's, part of why we wanted to do Beam.
Hi, folks. Today we will be talking to Chris Budin, Director of Rental Systems over at NMR Events. Chris has worked in this industry for a long time, and he has a lot of insightful things to say about it. To give you a little bit more context about how NMR is using Beam, NMR's rental business uses R2 to manage their rental inventory. And what Beam does in that context is it serves as a data enrichment platform. We integrate with NMR's R2 instance. We pull in all of their inventory listings. We enrich those inventory listings with asset data that we've pulled in straight from the manufacturer, things like documentation, firmware updates, software updates, and as is extremely important for a rental business that's moving equipment around all over the place, things like weights and dimensions. Chris has, as I said, a lot to say about where this industry should go, where he hopes the industry will go, and how he sees Beam in that context. So it was a great conversation. I hope you guys enjoy it. Today we're speaking to Chris Budin, Director of Rental Systems at NMR Events, and we are going to talk to him about his experience and NMR's experience using Beam. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. No, this is a pleasure. This is something that we don't typically get to do on the rental system side of things in this business, is talk about fun products that we're involved in. So it's great.
Awesome. I'm glad we could connect. For those of our listeners who aren't familiar with NMR, do you think you could set the context for us? Who is NMR? Who do you guys serve? What do you guys do?
Yeah. So we are. We kind of joke we're the biggest little company you've never heard of. We are, which primarily because we're not in the traditional rock and roll or we are in corporate AV, but we're really not in the rock and roll or professional sports or that kind of market. We're a trade. We were started as a trade show company about 35 years ago, primarily doing high-end trade show. Samsung at CES, those types of big technology booths. And it sort of has evolved. We about a dozen or so years ago started a industrial staging and events company side of the business, which is where I was initially hired, and sort of we've continued to grow exponentially. Obviously, COVID was a little bit of a damper of a year or two, but we came through that and are now stronger than ever. We've got about six locations at this point throughout the country in major markets, and we're constantly looking for expansion. And but everything is based out of New Jersey, and I would say Las Vegas are our two main hubs.
Got it. And then within this broader world of NMR, what role do you play as the Director of Rental Systems?
Yeah, so I was my early days at NMR was working in the audio department. I'm a trained audio engineer, working in recording studios and that kind of stuff. Historically went to school for that. And I got hired at NMR. I guess I've been there since 2012, and worked my way up through various positions to actually running the audio department for about 8 or 9 years. And I loved running the audio department. It was a great experience. But I was kind of looking for the next step, and I sort of fell into this transitional period where we were moving from rental system to a new rental system, being what we are presently at, R2, being R2. And I just kind of enjoyed that side of the business. I don't know, the rest is kind of history. I wound up being the rental guy. I miss audio a little bit, but this is a much more rewarding thing for me because it's a product that we kind of developed, like this Beam thing, in-house with UBS and these various partners. And we're able to really do a lot of customization, and I'm responsible for something that's sort of global in the company. It's not just this one department anymore. So
Got it. So let's get right into it. From the way you've described it, it sounds like NMR's business relies heavily on fixed assets. The way we talk about it at Beam is the companies we serve are dependent on assets to generate revenue. Can you tell us a little bit about what NMR's inventory looks like, what NMR's technology estate, if you will, looks like?
So being a trade show company, primarily sort of first and foremost, display rentals, computer rentals were our primary initial business, going back to the 80s when the company was sort of founded. And we've sort of remained true to that. We've added high-end video, audio, LED, all of these different products and departments sort of over time, but our roots kind of remain in the high-end displays, computers. LED now is a huge part of our business. Probably one of the most significant parts of our business is LED at this point. But our job is to rent something, is to purchase an asset and to rent it as many times as we can to get a depreciable return on it, and then offload the item and move on from it and rent it, buy a new item. So that's the goal of our job at the end of the day, and to do that as efficiently and as effectively as possible. We have anywhere between, I would say at this point at NMR, we're probably in the neighborhood of 450,000 assets globally. There's a little bit of caveat I always say to folks where it's the wild card with the rental systems is when you start to add multi-sites to when you have multiple sites. That just adds an exponential level of complication to the whole thing. And it's been one of the challenges for me, and one of the benefits to using something like R2 and Beam is that they're kind of positioned for that. So, but yeah, it's about 450,000 assets, I would say, at this point. We made the decision, one side thing, I guess, we made the decision right when we switched to R2 to really put an emphasis on the serialization and assetting of cable, which we didn't do historically. We had left cable to sort of be this quantity thing that was counted and sort of tracked, but not really, and not in all locations. And we serialized cable, which was a huge endeavor. And that has added a pretty significant amount of fixed assets to the system.
So first of all, things I'm taking away from that, 450,000 assets. That's a lot more than I was expecting. I knew
really?
you guys had a lot of assets.
Yeah.
I did not realize the scale of it. And I think what stands out to me even more about that is, unlike some of our other customers who have one location, say you're a broadcast studio, you have one location, you have a lot of assets, but they're not really moving around a lot. It sounds like not only do you guys have a lot of assets, but these assets are moving around all over the place, which I imagine has its own set of challenges.
The one thing I can elaborate on that with is this functionality. We call it in the R2 world pooling, and it's basically having this floating inventory between sites. We had a much very unique ability back in the day before COVID to maximize the return on inventory almost to a fault. Like we were trying to utilize these things until they were just done. And that's not always the best business model. And we've invested a lot of money in new equipment and different equipment, but we still kind of have that mantra in the back of our heads where it's like, we want to rent this thing as many times as we can and as efficiently as we can, but we also don't want to have this fixed inventory. Like a lot of systems are built on the fixed inventory model where each location, if you have an office here and an office there, they're each set up with their own inventory and they're kind of independent of each other. We never wanted that. We wanted to be able to service any location with 100% of one location's inventory or 100% of every location's inventory. And that was kind of the way we built R2, which has been very, very beneficial to us.
And I mean, you've already started talking about it, but it sounds like R2 is an integral tool in how you guys manage this inventory. Can you tell us a little bit about how NMR uses R2? What role does it serve in NMR's operations?
Yeah, we came from I don't want to call it a dumb system, but we were previously with another product that wasn't. We called it real-time availability. So at the point of rental, we weren't able to tell whether an item was available, and it kind of had it was always available, and that proved very difficult for us to be able to accurately forecast new purchases, but also rentals and where to position equipment throughout the country. And going to R2, that gave us this ability to forecast better because the availability is based in some parameters that R2 has set up and is probably their industry their trade secrets, but things like their pooling feature, which was big for us, which was a newer functionality when we started, that allowed you to float this inventory between multiple sites very much more efficiently than you were able to previously. And yeah, we looked at a couple other systems. R2 was the only one that was really good for multi-site when you get into multiple sites. And subsequently Beam has been, that's been one of the things that's been super helpful with Beam too, is that those guys and gals being willing to understand that methodology and that workflow for us, because it's a very important part to what we do, the multi-site thing. So.
Got it. And I think that's probably a good place to transition to talking about the role that Beam plays in NMR's in NMR's operations. David, our CEO, when I was first joining, he would often say Beam is a data company masquerading as an asset management company. Mm-hmm. And for those of you who are watching or listening who are Beam customers, you'll know that at the core of Beam's ethos is to be stewards of data. And at the core of our value proposition is this massive database that we have. And what we do with NMR and R2 is we take our data and we enrich NMR's inventory listings with data straight from the manufacturer, straight from these third-party resources, so that NMR's people have access to up-to-date asset data that they need to operate, maintain, and move all of these assets around. I'd be curious to know from you, Chris, at a high level, why is it important to have access to accurate asset data in the course of running a rental business like NMR's?
So part of this is selfishness, and it's because the alternative is that I got to put in the data, and it's time consuming and tedious and monotonous, and not probably the best use of mine or my team's time to be sitting there doing that type of I don't want to say it's menial data entry, but a lot of it is just it's monotonous sort of stuff, and it's stuff that could be suited in this world towards a better, easier way of doing it. And I have a lot of things that I would like to get to on a daily basis, other than looking up weights and dimensions for particular items. And I think that was the thing that appealed so much to me about Beam was it was partially a selfish thing because I wanted to make this thing easier on me to allow for other things to happen. But I also want continuity of data. I want this stuff to be consistent throughout sites. I've said from the beginning, I have this dream of one day having, if we get everybody to use Beam, we could all have the same data within sub-rental vendors and all of these things. And then we're all sort of renting the same stuff from the same, it's just stuff works then. It's just easy. So I think that would be my long-term goal, but it's for the short term. Yeah, it's great. It's continuity. It's the same thing. It's our users seeing the data in a more representative way of how the manufacturer wants to see it and how the rest of the world wants to see it, not just how I want to see it, which is sort of what we're looking for. So
right. And could you set the context for us a little bit? What happens when you don't have access to that data? What's the sort of worst case scenario?
I mean, we wind up like our old system, our previous system before R2 was we were just we didn't enter it, and we wind up with these huge chunks of inventory with just fields that aren't there. And while it seems kind of trivial to all right, let's say we don't enter a weight and a dim on 200 items. That's meaningful in the grand scheme of things if you rent those 200 items, because it's going to, there are forms and printouts and all sorts of things that are tallying these things all the time and calculating things and various formulas, and that affects that data. So if you don't have that stuff and it's not consistent and it's not all filled out all the time, you're kind of sort of selling your system short, and your system is not going to function the way it should. You're not going to be able to have, I mean, we're still working on it, and part of it was the big thing with going with Beam was the accuracy of that data and being able to say, I am confident in these reports, I'm confident in these printouts within R2 that this data is accurate and it's being tabulated or calculated based on a real data. And that's part of why we wanted to do Beam, go with Beam.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that you've had a good experience using Beam. I'd like to dig into that a little bit more about get into the specifics of what it's like to actually use the Beam product. Could you talk me through, maybe set the context with what that manual process you were describing earlier looked like of enriching data and what that process looks like now that you have Beam piping that data into R2?
Yeah, so I can give a good analogy, and again, it's not I'm not trying to sell myself short here, but like when running the audio department back in the day, I had a team of about six or seven folks working for me. In R2, well, some would argue, I'm sorry, some would argue that the audio department is vastly smaller in the grand scheme of things than running the whole rental system for the company. I have two people in R2. So the use of our time, we're trying to get some more, but the use of our time is much more precious to me on the R2 side of things than it is was in audio. So I'm constantly trying to find ways to make more efficient use of all of our time, me included. And I think that was the first thing that sort of was an indicator for me. I liked the idea with Beam of this ability that it gets better over time, and it has this enhanced functionality going forward with things like the R2 API. Because I dream of, and I don't think I realized it when we started the Beam process about a year and a half ago, or I guess it was a year ago. I didn't realize the level to which the documentation that exists on particular assets within Beam, things like instruction manuals or firmware versions or recalls or that kind of stuff. And that's a big thing that's like, we're not even integrating that really right now, that we could be looking towards the future in terms of mobile apps. And the R2 API, the more we expand that, gives us the functionality to do that. So it's also partially a R&D project for future development. So
that's good to hear, and I'm going to put a pin in that and get back to that in a second. About having access to this documentation, firmware, and things like that, and where you see the Beam R2 NMR relationship going. But I'd be curious to know, before we jump into that, you mentioned starting to use Beam all those months ago and learning about what data you can actually access in Beam. I'd be curious to know what the implementation process looked like for you. What was your experience interacting with Beam? What was your experience getting Beam integrated with your R2 system and your R2 instance?
Yeah, when I heard about Beam was at the last year at Infocom, attending their R2, we'll call it the R2 Summit, I guess, something like that, where all the R2 admins get together in one place and Ryan had presented on behalf of Beam, and I kind of I don't know, Ryan presented, and I kind of I like this guy. This guy's kind of up my he's my speed. He sort of seemed to understand the need and it was something that we were looking to fill. I mean, me and my one of the guys that works for me, Mike, when we had gone to this R2 Summit last year, we specifically went with the goal of how can we get some way of not having to deal with these data conversions anymore? These R2, they call them data conversions, where you're mass updating data in the system via Excel documents, but it still requires me to do most of the work. How do we get away from that? And then Ryan was there, and it sort of went, from there. I think that, obviously I'm not a software developer, nor do I pretend to be. And these guys are so much smarter than me when it comes to that stuff, but I had no idea what to expect developing a product and a software application for sort of mass consumption. So these guys and gals were really patient with me, and sort of got me through this process of I have no idea what I'm doing here. I'm just here to be an advisor and tell you I like that or I don't like that. But throughout the process, it's been really, really eye-opening to see the product develop, to see the changes that we've sort of discussed and implemented together based on feedback from my folks and me, as well as Beam. And Beam's not afraid to, Ryan and Gabriel and all those folks are not afraid to tell me when it's not a good idea. And which is really, I appreciate that more than anything usually, because I'm full of bad ideas. So, but yeah, so that's really, it's been a great experience so far. I think we're really getting to the place now where we're starting to look at that long-term development stuff, and see what the product is capable of next. And that's really exciting.
So I think that's a good segue back to what I put a pin in earlier. Where do you see Beam as a product in the context of NMR going in the next, I don't know, 3-5 years?
I think one of the things, obviously I touched on it before, this idea that multiple or different vendors of different people within this industry, different companies or instances of systems, can start to use a similar or consistent methodology of naming conventions and product SKUs and the way they sort their data and that sort of stuff. And that would be huge. I mean, that would be a huge thing for the industry to be able to have, sub rental partners. I know from my days in audio, going to, knowing the intricacies of each different sub-rental vendor and their inventory and how they name things when they are the same thing. In most cases, they could have two identical products, but they just call them very different things. I know that. Not everybody does. So it's that's a big part of this, I think, going forward. And I think listen, I envision a place, a day when in the future where folks on site, when they're on site doing jobs for us, have access in a mobile format to these instruction manuals and these firmware updates and this stuff that these manufacturer resources that exist within Beam, so that if they get a piece of equipment they don't understand how to use, or they have a issue with, they have all of the resources they can that are available to them at their fingertips, kind of very easily. And I think that's part of it too. So.
Awesome. I think that's we are completely in line as to where we want to see the industry go. That's one thing we talk about a lot at Beam. I know as a marketer, when we're making marketing materials, one of the things that often comes up in conversations I have is this idea that we are pushing towards this single data standard across the industry, just so that everyone's speaking a common language. So it's extremely heartening to hear that come from someone who's actually in the industry, on the ground, working with all of this equipment. That's pretty much all of the questions that I had for you today, Chris. I really appreciate you taking out the time to speak with us. I think that this conversation will be useful for other folks who are in your position, who are trying to evaluate whether Beam is the right fit for them. So thanks for making the time for us.
Thanks so much.